Okay, I'm kind of excited. I am going to read aloud my first adult book. I mean, I have read countless stories, small and large, to children, because I'm of a vintage age. Well, maybe not, because I'm not 90 or something. Maybe that's. Anyway, it's for discussion on another day. Anyway, I'm going to read The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks for my Valentine present for myself, except that I realize now I'm starting so late, I'll probably never finish this on Valentine's Day. I'll have to eke it out instead of all in one big swoop. But talking about The Notebook, I mean, oh my, I feel like the casting of the movie The Notebook was so totally correct that the way I had felt about these characters when I first read the book were embodied by the actors and actresses chosen to create those personas on the screen. So delightful, huh? You know, and it's funny, and having known Ryan, spent a little time with Ryan Gosling, it's true that he was really nice, like Noah. So anyway, no further ado, here's Gina Bellina's lines for the adults in the room. The first chapter of The Notebook, Miracles. Who am I? And how, I wonder, will the story end? The sun has come up, and I am sitting by a window that is foggy, with the breath of a life gone by. I'm a sight this morning, 2 shirts, heavy pants, a scarf, wrapped twice around my neck, and tucked into a thick sweater knitted by my daughter 30 birthdays ago. The thermostat in my room is set as high as it will go, and a smaller space heater sits directly behind me. It clicks and groans and spews hot air like a fairy tale dragon. And still, my body shivers with a cold that will never go away. A cold that has been 80 years in the making. 80 years. I think sometimes, and despite my own acceptance of my age, it still amazes me that I haven't been warm since George Bush was president. I wonder if this is how it is for everyone at my age. My life, it isn't easy to explain. It has not been the rip-roaring spectacular I fancied it would be, but neither have I burrowed around with the gophers. I suppose it has most resembled a blue chip stock, fairly stable, more ups and downs, and gradually trending upward over time. A good buy, a lucky buy, and I've learned that not everyone can say this about his life. But do not be misled. I am nothing special. Of this I'm sure. I'm a common man with common thoughts, and I've led a common life. There are no monuments dedicated to me, and my name was soon to be forgotten. But I've loved another with all my heart and soul. And to me, this has always been enough. The romantics would call this a love story. The cynics would call it a tragedy. In my mind, it's a little bit of both, and no matter how you choose to view it, in the end, it does not change the fact that it involves a great deal of my life and the path I've chosen to follow. I have no complaints about my path and the places it has taken me. Enough complaints to fill a circus tent about other things, maybe. But the path I've always chosen has always been the right one, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. Time, unfortunately, doesn't make it easy to stay on course. The path is straight as ever, but now it is strewn with the rocks and gravel that accumulate over a lifetime. Until 3 years ago, it would have been easy to ignore, but it's impossible now. There is a sickness rolling through my body. I'm neither strong nor healthy, and my days are spent like an old party balloon, listless, spongy, growing softer over time. I cough. Those squinted eyes, I check my watch. I realize it is time to go. I stand from my seat by the window and shuffle across the room, stopping at the desk to pick up the notebook I have read 100 times. I do not glance through it. Instead, I slip it beneath my arm and continue on my way to the place I must go. I walk on tiled floors, white in color and speckled with gray, like my hair and the hair of most people here, though I'm the only one in the hallway this morning. They are in their rooms alone, except for television, but they are like me. They're used to it. A person can get used to anything if given enough time. I hear the muffled sounds of crying in the distance and know exactly who is making those sounds. Then the nurses see me and we smile at each other and exchange greetings. They are my friends, and we talk often, but I am sure they wonder about me and the things that I go through every day. I listen as they begin to whisper among themselves as I pass. Oh, there he goes again, I hear. I hope it turns out well. But they say nothing directly to me about it. I'm sure they think it would hurt me to talk about it so early in the morning. And knowing myself as I do, I think they're probably right. A minute later, I reach the room. The door has been propped open for me, as it usually is. There are two others in the room, and they too smile at me, and I enter. Good morning, they say with cheery voices, and I take a moment to ask about the kids and the schools and upcoming vacations. We talk about the crying for a minute or so. They do seem to notice that they have become numb to it. But then again, so have I. Afterward, I sit in the chair that has come to be shaped like me. They are finishing up now, and her clothes are on, but still, she is crying. It will become quieter after they leave. I know the excitement of the morning always upsets her, and today is no exception. Finally, the shade is opened, and the nurses walk out. Both of them touch me and smile as they walk by. I wonder what that means. And still, she's still crying. Just a little. I sit for just a second and stare at her. But she doesn't return the look. I understand, for she doesn't know who I am. I'm a stranger to her. Then turning away, I bow my head and pray silently for the strength I know I will need. I have always been a firm believer in God and the power of prayers, though to be honest, my faith has made for a list of questions I definitely want answered after I'm gone. Ready now. On go the glasses. Out of my pocket becomes a magnifier, which I need now. I put it on the table for a moment while I open the notebook. It takes 2 licks on my gnarled fingers to get the well-worn cover open to the first page. Then I put the magnifier in place. There's always a moment right before I begin to read the story when my mind churns. I wonder, will it happen today? I don't know. For I never know beforehand, and deep down, it really doesn't matter. It's the possibility that keeps me going, not the guarantee. I sort of wager on my part, and though you may call me a dreamer or fool or any other thing, I believe that anything is possible. I realize the odds in science are against me, but science is not the total answer. This I know. This I have learned in my lifetime, and that leaves me with the belief that miracles, no matter how inexplicable or unbelievable, are real and can occur without regard to the natural order of things. So once again, just as I do every day, I begin to read the notebook aloud so that she can hear it in the hope that the miracle that has come to dominate my life will once again prevail. And maybe, just maybe, I will. It was early October 1946, and Noah Callahan, I can't believe I pronounced my name wrong, Noah Calhoun, watched the fading sun sink lower from the wraparound porch of his plantation-style home. He liked to sit here in the evenings, especially after working hard all day, and let his thoughts wander without conscious direction. It was how he relaxed, a routine he'd learned from his father. He especially liked to look at the trees and their reflections in the river. North Carolina trees are beautiful in deep autumn. Greens, yellows, reds, oranges, every shade in between. Their dazzling colors glow with the sun, and for the hundredth time, Noah Calhoun wondered if the original owners of the house had spent their evenings thinking the same things. The house was built in 1772, making it one of the oldest as well as largest homes in New Bern. Originally, it was the main house on a working plantation, and he had bought it right after the war ended and had spent the last 11 months and a small fortune repairing it. The reporter from the Raleigh paper had done an article on it a few weeks ago and said it was one of the finest restorations he'd ever seen. At least the house was. The remaining property was another story, and that was where he'd spent most of the day. The home sat on 12 acres adjacent to Bryce's Creek, and he'd worked on the wooden fence that lined the other three sides of the property, checking for dry rot or termites, replacing posts when he had to. He still had more work to do on it, especially on the west side, and as he'd put the tools away earlier, he made a mental note to call and have some more lumber delivered. He'd gone into the house, drunk a glass of sweet tea, and then showered. He always showered at the end of the day, the water washing away both dirt and fatigue. Afterward, he combed his hair back, put on some faded jeans and a long-sleeved blue shirt, poured himself another glass of sweet tea, and had gone to the porch where he now sat, where he sat every day at this time. He stretched his arms above his head, then out to the sides, rolling his shoulders as he completed the routine. He felt good and clean now, fresh. His shoulders were tired, and he knew he'd be a little sore tomorrow, but he was pleased that he had accomplished most of what he had wanted to do. Noah reached for his guitar, remembering his father as he did so, thinking how much he missed him. He strummed once, adjusted the tension on two strings, and then strummed again. This time, it sounded about right, and he began to play. Soft music, quiet music. He hummed for a little while at first, and then began to sing as night came down around him. He played and sang until the sun was gone and the sky was black. It was a little after 7 when he quit, and he settled back into his chair and began to rock. By habit, he looked upward and saw Orion and the Big Dipper, Gemini and the Pole Star, twinkling in the autumn sky. He started to run the numbers in his head, then stopped. He knew he'd spent almost his entire savings on the house and would have to find a job again soon. But he pushed this thought away and decided to enjoy the remaining months of restoration without worrying about it. It would work out for him, he knew. It always did. Besides, thinking about money usually bored him. Early on, he'd learned to enjoy simple things, things that couldn't be bought, and he had a hard time in understanding people who felt otherwise. It was another trait he had got from his father. Clem, his hound dog, came up to him then and nuzzled his hand before lying down at his feet. "Hey, girl, how you doing?" he asked as he patted her head, and she whined softly, her soft, round eyes peering upward. A car accident had taken her leg, but she still moved well enough and kept him company as quick and quiet nights like these. He was 31 now, not too old, but old enough to be lonely. He hadn't dated since he'd been back here, hadn't met anyone who remotely interested him. It was his own fault, he knew. There was something that kept a distance between him and any woman who started to get close. Something he wasn't sure he could change, even if he tried. And sometimes in the moments right before sleep came, he wondered if he was destined to be alone forever. The evening passed, staying warm, nice. Noah listened to the crickets and the rustling leaves, thinking that the sound of nature was more real and aroused more emotions than things like cars and planes. Natural things gave back more than they took, and their sounds always brought him back to the way man was supposed to be. There were times during the war, especially after a major engagement, when he had often thought about these simple sounds. It'll keep you from going crazy, his father had told him the day he'd shipped out. It's God's music, and it'll take you home. He finished his tea, went inside, found a book, then turned on the porch light on his way back out. After sitting down again, he looked at the book. It was old, the cover was worn, and the pages were stained with mud and water. It was Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, and he had carried it with him throughout the war. It had even taken a bullet for him once. He rubbed the cover, dusting it off just a little. Then he let the book open randomly and read the words in front of him. This is thy hour, O soul, thy free flight into the wordless, away from books, away from art, the day erased, the lesson done. Thee fully north. Oh my gosh, let me start that again. This is thy hour, O soul, thy free flight into the wordless, away from books, away from art, the day erased, the lesson done. Thee fully forth emerging, silent, gazing, pondering the themes thou lovest best, night, sleep, death, and the stars. He smiled to himself. For some reason, Whitman always reminded him of New Bern, and he was glad he'd come back. Though he'd been away for 14 years, this was home, and he knew a lot of people here, most of them from his youth. It wasn't surprising, like so many southern towns, the people who lived here never changed. They just grew a bit older. His best friend these days was Gus, a 70-year-old black man who lived down the road. They had met a couple of weeks after Noah bought the house, when Gus had shown up with some homemade liquor and Brunswick stew, and the two had spent their first evening together getting drunk and telling stories. Now Gus would show up a couple of nights a week, usually around 8, and with 4 kids and 11 grandchildren in the house, he needed to get out of the house now and then, and Noah couldn't blame him. Usually Gus would bring his harmonica, and after talking for a little while, they'd play a few songs together. Sometimes they played for hours. He'd come to regard Gus as family. There really wasn't anyone else, at least not since his father died last year. He was an only child. His mother had died of influenza when he was 2. And though he had wanted to at one time, he had never married. But he had been in love once. That he knew. Once. And only once, and a long time ago. And it had changed him. Forever. Perfect love did that to a person. And this had been perfect. Coastal clouds slowly began to roll across the evening sky, turning silver with the reflection of the moon. And as they thickened, he leaned his head back and rested it against the rocking chair. His legs moved automatically, keeping a steady rhythm, and as he did most evenings, he felt his mind drifting back to a warm evening like this 14 years ago. It was just after graduation, 1932, the opening night of the New River Festival. The town was out in full, enjoying barbecue and games of chance. It was humid that night. For some reason, he remembered that clearly. He arrived home alone, and as he strolled through the crowd looking for friends, he saw Finn and Sarah, two people he'd grown up with, talking to a girl he'd never seen before. She was pretty, he remembered thinking, and when he finally joined them, she looked his way with a pair of hazy eyes that kept on coming. "Hi," she'd said simply as she offered her hand. "Finley's told me a lot about you." An ordinary beginning, something that would have been forgotten had it been anyone but her. But as he shook her hand and met those striking emerald eyes, he knew before he'd taken her his next breath that she was the one who he could spend the rest of his life looking for, but never find again. She seemed that good, that perfect, while a summer wind blew through the trees. From there it went like a tornado wind. Finn told him she was spending the summer in New Bern with her family because her father worked for R.J. Reynolds, and though he only nodded, the way she was looking at him made his silence seem okay. Finn laughed then because he knew what was happening. And Sarah suggested they get some cherry cokes, and the four of them stayed at the festival until the crowds were thin and everything closed up for the night. They met the following day and the day after that, and they soon became inseparable. Every morning but Sunday, when he had to go to church, he would finish his chores as quickly as possible, then make a straight line to Fort Totten Park, where she'd be waiting for him. Because she was a newcomer and hadn't spent time in a small town before, they spent their days doing things that were completely new to her. He taught her how to bait a line and fish the shallows for largemouth bass, and took her exploring through the backwoods of the Croatian forest, and they rode in canoes and watched summer thunderstorms. And to him it seemed as though they'd always known each other. But he learned things as well. As the town danced in the tobacco barn, it was she who taught him how to waltz and do the Charleston. And though they stumbled through the first few songs, her patience with him eventually paid off, and they danced together until the music ended. He walked her home afterward, and when they paused on the porch after saying good night, he kissed her for the first time and wondered why he had waited as long as he had. Later in the summer, he brought her to this house, looking past the decay, and told her that one day he was going to own it and fix it up. They spent hours together talking about their dreams, his of seeing the world, hers of being an artist. And on a humid night in August, they both lost their virginity. When she left 3 weeks later, she took a piece of him and the rest of summer with her. He watched her leave town on an early rainy morning, watched through eyes that hadn't slept the night before, and then went home and packed a bag. He spent the next week alone on Harker's Island. Noah ran his hands through his hair and checked his watch. 8:12. He got up and walked to the front of the house and looked up the road. Gus wasn't in sight. Noah figured he wouldn't be coming. He went back to the rocker and sat again. He remembered talking to Gus about her. The first time he mentioned her, Gus started to shake his head and laugh. So that's the ghost. That's the ghost you've been running from. And when asked what he meant, Gus said, the ghost, the memory. I've been watching you, working day and night, slaving so hard you barely have time to catch your breath. People do that for 3 reasons. Either they crazy or stupid or trying to forget. And with you, I knew you was trying to forget. I just didn't know what. He thought about Gus and what he'd said. Gus was right, of course. New Bern was haunted now, haunted by the ghost of her memory. He saw her in Fort Totten Park, their place every time he walked by, either sitting on the bench or standing by the gate, always smiling. Blonde hair, softly touching her shoulders, her eyes the color of emeralds. And when he sat on the porch at night with his guitar, he saw her beside him, listening quietly as he played the music of his childhood. He felt the same when he went to Gaston's drugstore or to the Masonic Theater, or even when he strolled downtown. Everywhere he looked, he saw her image, saw things that brought her back to life. It was odd, he knew that. He had grown up in New Bern, spent his first 17 years here, but when he thought about New Bern, he seemed to remember only the last summer. The summer they were together. Other memories were simply fragments, pieces here and there of growing up, and few, if any, evoked any feeling. He had told Gus about it one night, and not only had Gus understood, but he had been the first to explain why. He said simply, "My daddy used to tell me that the first time you fall in love, it changes your life forever. And no matter how you try, the feeling never goes away. This girl you've been telling me about was your first love. And no matter what you do, she stayed with you forever." Noah shook his head, and when her image began to fade, he returned to Whitman. He read for an hour, looking up every now and then to see raccoons and possums scurrying near the creek. And at 9:30, he closed the book, went upstairs to the bedroom, and wrote in his journal, including both personal observations and the work he'd accomplished on the house. 40 minutes later, he was sleeping. Clem wandered up the stairs, sniffed him as he slept, and then paced in circles before finally curling up at the foot of his bed. Earlier that evening, and 100 miles away, she sat alone on the porch swing of her parents' home, one leg crossed beneath her. The seat had been slightly damp when she sat down. Rain had fallen earlier, hard and stinging. But the clouds were fading now, and she looked past them toward the stars, wondering if she'd made the right decision. She'd struggled with it for days and had struggled some more this evening. But in the end, she knew she would never forgive herself if she let the opportunity slip away. Lon didn't know the real reason she left the following morning. The week before, she'd hinted to him that she might want to visit some antique shops near the coast. "It's just a couple of days," she said. "And besides, I need a break from planning the wedding." She felt bad about the lie, but knew there was no way she could tell him the truth. Her leaving had nothing to do with him, and it wouldn't be fair of her to ask him to understand. It was an easy drive for Raleigh, slightly more than 2 hours, and she arrived a little before 11. She checked into a small inn downtown, went to her room, and packed her suitcase, hanging her dresses in the closet and putting everything else in the drawers. She had a quick lunch, asked the waitress for directions to the nearest antique stores, and then spent the next few hours shopping. By 4:30, she was back in her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, picked up the phone, and called Lon. He couldn't speak long. He was due in court, but before they hung up, she gave him the phone number where she was staying and promised to call the following day. Good, she thought, while hanging up the phone. Routine conversation, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to make him suspicious. She'd known him almost 4 years now. It was 1942 when they met, the world at war, and America 1 year in. Everyone was doing their part, and she was volunteering at the hospital downtown. She was both needed and appreciated there, but it was more difficult than she'd expected. The first waves of wounded young soldiers were coming home, and she spent her days with broken men and shattered bodies. When Lon, with all his easy charm, introduced himself at a Christmas party, she saw in him exactly what she needed. Someone with confidence about the future and a sense of humor that drove all her fears away. He was handsome, intelligent, and driven, a successful lawyer 8 years older than she, and he pursued his job with passion, not only winning cases, but also making a name for himself. She understood his vigorous pursuit of success. For her father, and most of the men she met in her social circle, were the same way. Like them, he'd been raised that way, and in the caste system of the South, family name and accomplishments are often the most important consideration in marriage. In some cases, they were the only consideration. Though she had quietly rebelled against this idea since childhood and had dated a few men best described as reckless, she found herself drawn to Lon's easy ways and had gradually come to love him. Despite the long hours he worked, he was good to her. He was a gentleman, both mature and responsible, and during those terrible periods of the war when she needed someone to hold her, he never once turned her away. She felt secure with him, and he knew he loved her as well, and that was why she had accepted his proposal. Thinking these things made her feel guilty about being here, and she knew she would pack her things and leave before she changed her mind. She had done it once before, long ago, and if she left now, she was sure she would never have the strength to return here again. She picked up her pocketbook and hesitated and almost made it to the door. But coincidence had pushed her here, and she put the pocketbook down, again realizing that if she quit now, she would always wonder what would have happened, and she didn't think she could live with that. She went to the bathroom and started a bath. Now, after checking the temperature, she walked to the dresser, taking off her gold earrings as she crossed the room. She found her makeup bag, opened it, pulled out a razor and a bar of soap, then undressed in front of the bureau. She had been called beautiful since she was a young girl, and once she was naked, she looked at herself in the mirror. Her body was firm and well-proportioned, breasts softly rounded, stomach flat, legs slim. She'd inherited her mother's high cheekbones, smooth skin, and blonde hair, but her best feature was her own. She had eyes like ocean waves, as Lon liked to say. Taking the razor and soap, she went to the bathroom again, turned off the faucet, set a towel where she could reach it, and stepped in gingerly. She liked the way a bath relaxed her, and she slipped below or lower in the water, and the day had been long, and her back was tense, but she was pleased she had finished shopping so quickly. She had to go back to Raleigh with something tangible, and the things she had picked out would work fine. She made a mental note to find the names of some of the stores in the Beaufort area, and then suddenly doubted she would need to. Lon wasn't the type to check up on her. She reached for the soap, lathered up, began to shave her legs, and as she did, she thought about her parents and what they would think of her behavior. No doubt they would disapprove, especially her mother. Her mother had never really accepted what had happened the summer they'd spent here, and wouldn't accept it now, no matter what reason she gave. She soaked a while longer in the tub before finally getting out and toweling off. She went to the closet and looked for a dress, finally choosing a long yellow one that dipped slightly in the front, the kind of dress that was common in the South. She slipped it on and looked in the mirror, turning from side to side. It fit her well and made her look feminine, but she eventually decided against it and put it back on the hanger. Instead, she found a more casual, less revealing dress and put that on. Light blue with a touch of lace. It buttoned up the front, and though it didn't look quite as nice as the first one, it conveyed an image she thought would be more appropriate. She wore little makeup and just a touch of eyeshadow and mascara to accent her eyes. Perfume next, not too much. She found a pair of small hooped earrings, put them on, and slipped on the tan, low-heeled sandals she had been wearing earlier. She brushed her blonde hair, pinned it up, looked in the mirror. No, it was too much, she thought, and she let it back down. Better. And when she was finished, she stepped back and evaluated herself. She looked good. Not too dressy, not too casual. She didn't want to overdo it. After all, she didn't know what to expect. It had been a long time, probably too long, and maybe many different things could have happened, even things she didn't want to consider. She looked down and saw her hands were shaking, and she laughed to herself. It was strange. She wasn't normally this nervous. Like Lon, she had always been confident, even as a child. She remembered what it had been a problem, and how it had been a problem at times, especially when she dated, because it had intimidated most of the boys her age. She found her pocketbook and car keys, and then picked up the room key. She turned it over in her hand a couple of times, thinking, "You've come this far, don't give up now," and almost left then, but instead sat on the bed again. She checked her watch. Almost 6 o'clock. She knew she had to leave in a few minutes. She didn't want to arrive after dark, but she needed a little more time. "Damn," she whispered. "What am I doing here? I shouldn't be here. There's no reason for it." But once she said it, she knew it wasn't true. There was something here. If nothing else, she would have her answer. She opened her pocketbook, thumbed through it until she came to a folded up piece of newspaper, and after taking it out slowly, almost reverently, being careful not to rip it, she unfolded it and stared at it for a while. "This is why," she finally said to herself. This is what it's all about. Noah got up at 5, kayaked for an hour up Bryce's Creek, as he usually did. And when he finished, he changed into his work clothes, warmed some biscuits from the day before, grabbed a couple of apples, and washed his breakfast down with 2 cups of coffee. He looked and worked on the fencing again, repairing most of the posts that needed it. It was Indian summer. The temperature was over 80 degrees, and by lunchtime, he was hot and tired and glad for the break. He ate at the creek because the mullets were jumping. He liked to watch them jump 3 or 4 times and glide through the air before vanishing into the brackish water. For some reason, he had always been pleased by the fact that their instinct hadn't changed for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. Sometimes he wondered if man's instincts had changed in that time, and always concluded that they hadn't, at least in the basic, most primal ways. As far as he could tell, man had always been aggressive, always striving to dominate, trying to control the world and everything in it. The war in Europe and Japan proved that. He quit working a little after 3 and walked to a small shed that sat near his dock. He went in, found his fishing pole, a couple of lures, and some live crickets he kept on hand, and then walked out to the dock, baited his hook, and cast his line. Okay, fishing always made him reflect on his life, and he did it now. After his mother died, he could remember spending his days in a dozen different homes, and for one reason or another, he stuttered badly as a child and was teased for it. He began to speak less and less, and by the age of 5, he wouldn't speak at all. When he started classes, his teachers thought he was retarded and recommended that he be pulled out of school. Instead, his father took matters into his own hands. He kept him in school and afterward made him come to the lumberyard where he worked to haul and stack wood. "It's good that we spend some time together," he would say as they worked side by side, "just like my daddy and I did." During that time together, his father would talk about birds and animals or tell stories and legends common to North Carolina. Within a few months, Noah was speaking again, though not well, and his father decided to teach him to read with books of poetry. "Learn to read this out loud, and you'll be able to say anything you want to." His father had been right again, and by the following year, Noah had lost his stutter. But he continued to go to the lumberyard every day simply because his father was there, and in the evenings he would read the works of Whitman and Tennyson aloud. As his father rocked beside him, he had been reading poetry ever since. When he got a little older, he spent most of his weekends and vacations alone. He explored the forest in his first canoe, following Bryce's Creek for 20 miles until he could go no further, and then hiked the remaining miles to the coast. Camping and exploring became his passion, and he spent hours in the forest, sitting beneath blackjack oak trees, whistling quietly and playing his guitar for beavers and geese and wild blue herons. Poets knew that isolation in nature, far from people and things man-made, was good for the soul, and he'd always identified with poets. Although he was quiet, years of heavy lifting at the lumberyard helped him excel in sports, and his athletic success led to popularity. He enjoyed the football games and track meets, and though most of his teammates spent their free time together as well, he rarely joined them. An occasional person found him arrogant. Most simply figured he had grown up a bit faster than everyone else. He had a few girlfriends in school, but none had ever made an impression on him, except for one. And she came after graduation. Allie. He's Allie. He remembered talking to Finn about Allie after they'd left the festival that first night, and Finn had laughed. And then he made 2 predictions. First, that they would fall in love, and second, that it wouldn't work out. There was a slight tug at his line, and Noah hoped for a largemouth bass, but the tugging eventually stopped, and after reeling his line in and checking the bait, he cast again. Finn ended up being right on both counts. Most of the summer, she had to make excuses to her parents whenever they wanted to see each other. It wasn't that they didn't like him. It was that he was from a different class. Too poor. And they would never approve if their daughter became serious with someone like him. I don't care what my parents think. I love you and always will, she would say. We'll find a way. We'll find a way to be together. But in the end, they couldn't. By early September, the tobacco had been harvested. She had no choice but to return with her family, Winston-Salem. Only the summer is over, Allie, not us, he'd said the morning she left. Will never be over. But they were. For a reason he didn't fully understand, the letters he wrote went unanswered. Eventually, he decided to leave New Bern to help get her off his mind, but also because the Depression made earning a living in New Bern almost impossible. He went first to Norfolk, worked at a shipyard for 6 months before he was laid off, then moved to New Jersey because he'd heard the economy wasn't so bad there. He eventually found a job in a scrapyard, separating scrap metal from everything else. The owner, a Jewish man named Morris Goldman, was intent on collecting as much scrap metal as he could, convinced that a war was going to start in Europe and that America would be dragged in again. Noah thought, didn't even care about the reasons. He was just happy to have a job. His years in the lumberyard had toughened him to this type of labor, and he worked hard. But not only did it help him keep his mind off Allie during the day, but it was something he felt he had to do. His daddy had always said, give a day's work for a day's pay. Anything less is stealing. That attitude pleased his boss. It's a shame you aren't Jewish, Goldman would say. You're such a fine boy in so many other ways. It was the best compliment Goldman could give. He continued to think about Allie, especially at night. He wrote her once a month but never received a reply. Eventually, he wrote a final letter and forced himself to accept the fact that the summer they'd spent with one another was the only thing they'd ever share. Still, though she stayed with him. 3 years after the last letter, he went to Winston-Salem in the hope of finding her. He went to her house, discovered that she had moved, and after talking to some neighbors, finally called RGR. The girl who answered the phone was new and did not recognize the name, but she poked around the personnel files for him. She found out that Allie's father had left the company and that no forwarding address was listed. That trip was the first and last time he ever looked for her. For the next 8 years, he worked for Goldman. At first, he was one of the 12 employees, but as the years dragged on, the company grew and he was promoted. By 1940, he had mastered the business and was running the entire operation, brokering the deals and managing a staff of 30. The yard had become the largest scrap metal dealer on the East Coast. And during that time, he dated a few different women. He became serious with one, a waitress from the local diner with deep blue eyes and silky black hair. Although they had dated for 2 years and had many good times together, he never came to feel the same way about her as he did about Allie. But neither did he forget her. She was a few years older than he was, and it was she who taught him the ways to please a woman, the places to touch and kiss, where to linger, the things to whisper. They would sometimes spend an entire day in bed, holding each other and making the kind of love that fully satisfied both of them. She had known they wouldn't be together forever. Toward the end of their relationship, she told him once, "I wish I could give you what you're looking for, but I don't know what it is. There's a part of you that you keep closed off from everyone, including me. It's as if I'm not the one you're really with. Your mind, it's on someone else." He tried to deny it, but she didn't believe him. "I'm a woman. I know these things. When you look at me sometimes, I know you're seeing someone else. It's like you keep waiting for her to pop out of thin air to take you away from all this."